Here's a fun question. How old were you when you started playing Genshin Impact? And if you started in 2020, how old are you now? I started to have this question when I saw, well, SNEZHNAYA, and it really got me thinking, we've come so far with this game. It started as an escape for me in my early 20s. It was the pandemic and I really was just not in a great place. Compare that to now where I'm approaching my 30s, yes, I'm ancient, and how differently my life currently is compared to when I first stepped into Mondstadt. Genshin has actually been a part of my daily life for so long that it's actually crazy just how different I've become since then. Which got me thinking, I can't be the only one that's grown up with this game in the past 6 years, right? So has the Genshin audience inevitably outgrown the game that once meant so much? At least, as it always is with my channel, in terms of its story, characters, and narrative. Have I outgrown this game? How does one even outgrow the story of a game? I mean, if we're talking about the game's mechanics, that's easier to answer, like sometimes you just get bored. But story, that's a little more complicated to answer. Disclaimer as always, this is mostly my opinion. You are free to disagree. I'm not a video essayist. Yes, I make video essays, but I'm just here for fun. So don't say I didn't warn you. Before we can even think about Genshin's growth as a game, I think it's important to go back to where we started to remember this game when it just came out almost 6 years ago. 2020 was a weird year. I was personally so early into my career. I did not have a YouTube channel. The world was shutting down and life felt like it was left in stasis. And Genshin felt like an escape for a lot of people. It became a place to hang out with friends. I certainly remember spending Lantern Rite with my friends, taking photos, releasing lanterns, and honestly just having this brand new world filled with fantasy and whimsy and interesting characters just became the selling point for the game. It was an escape for people who were stuck in quarantine. Genshin's biggest draw for me back then has always been its characters, world exploration, and story, and music also. Genshin's music slaps. I've already said this a couple of times, but I actually really enjoyed Mondstadt's Archon quest. It didn't have the most groundbreaking storyline, and some might even find it boring, but I've always felt like it did its job pretty well. It was a fun introductory quest to the world. It had a fun ensemble. It introduced Venti as the first Archon, and I always thought that Venti is one of the most interesting characters even to this day. I think Hoyo did a good job in making him likable, cheeky, and yet still kinda sus. Diluc, Jean, Amber, Lisa, and Kea have all gone on to become beloved characters. I still remember the intrigue in seeing Kea and Diluc interact for the first time. And honestly, just like any other game or story, sometimes it can be hard to follow all of the new lingo that the game throws at you, like Archon and Gnosis, or how Zhongli, Morax, and Rex Lapis were all the same person. But it was a fun new world that we got to experience during a time where everything seemed bleak. It served as an escape and it had a fun, simple story with a fun companion. The summer events that followed also provided a lighthearted escape for us. The way they brought the Mondstadt ensemble and also giving the players an entirely new area to explore was just amazing at the time. I think by this time we only had Mondstadt, Liyue, and Dragonspine. So having the Golden Apple Archipelago being another fun area to explore with fun, light-hearted stories felt like something we needed as players who are still mostly stuck inside. Looking back at the game like this makes me feel like I'm reminiscing about a summer beach day from my school days. It feels so far away and life was so much simpler even though the world was on fire. And during that time, a lot of the stories that we experienced in Genshin were lighter. There are stories of grief and sadness, and there are really dark ones if you know where to look, but the main story, at least in Mondstadt and Liyue, were pretty straightforward. In Mondstadt, it was about a cast of characters, all unique and endearing in their own way, trying to save their city from a corrupted dragon. There was an antagonist, in this case Dvalin, and a cast of heroes. And with that simple format, they managed to establish the concept of Archons, multiple character dynamics, and also giving us the players a glimpse into the world of Teyvat. And even in those early days, the game didn't really shy away from making their featured banner characters a bit more complex, even if it's just in glimpses in their own story quests. For example, there are Venti and Zhongli's feelings of grief and loss. There's Childe's moral ambiguity. These are actually really good building blocks on what would eventually make interesting and layered characters, you know, despite having a simpler main quest. Honestly, Genshin being such a light and simple game story-wise, at least in the main quest and story quest, was actually pretty expected, especially back then, given that the sense of wonder, exploration, and escapism that it was trying to offer to its players at the time. It was just expected. Like, making it too grim and dark probably wouldn't make it very appealing to a lot of people who were looking to escape the reality of a global pandemic. And Genshin has always been a game that wanted to appeal to everyone in mechanics and in story, and that in itself can be both a strength and a weakness. Its strength is that it suits a game like Genshin where its main goal is to appeal to the most players possible. It's easier to introduce characters, which Genshin has a lot of, in more simple stories that are straightforward with a clear villain, clear hero, minimal nuance. Simpler stories also often work better for people who are there to enjoy the combat and exploration more. They're easy to digest, so even the players who skip through most dialogues and half listens to what's going on when playing the game will have a pretty okay understanding of what's going on. Like, if you skim through Mondstadt, there's a pretty big chance that you'll know the story is about a group of characters trying to defeat some dragon, even if you don't know who that dragon is or what an Archon is at that point. You don't even have to know the main ensemble's relationship with each other. Now, a clear weakness that simpler stories have is that they get old really fast. They become predictable and they become boring. I think Mondstadt and Liyue still worked because it was so early and so simple that it was just the right move for Genshin's target audience in 2020, or in the beginning, which again, their target audience is just basically anyone that might be interested in the game. Even players who enjoy a deeper and nuanced story probably didn't mind the simpler setting because the game just had so much to offer. The sense of novelty and excitement probably softened the landing a little bit, and since it was the prologue and the first chapter of the game, it's just easier to accept a simple looking story and unestablished characters as building blocks. It's just expected. Genshin was clearly building towards something. They had shown us glimpses of a complex and oftentimes dark world, but it's so early in the story that it's probably not our time yet to experience that part of this world. Another game mechanic that I think is also quite central to the game's early days and its style of storytelling is the passive, sometimes mute traveler, and Paimon being their guide or talking guide. Paimon's role has always been established as the guide for the traveler's journey in Teyvat, and as much as I have complained about Paimon, that's a pretty expected role. And don't worry, I also do owe Paimon an apology at this point, but that's a different video. The traveler is new to the land, and the game needs a character that can help players understand this very massive world that they're building. And Paimon's function has always been to simplify things for the players so everyone would be on the same page, because dialogue in this game can be so convoluted and long. Genshin's dialogue being weak is also kinda expected, at least if you're playing in English. This is purely due to the fact that it's all translated dialogue, so the localizing team had to translate meaning, nuance, and also match the movement of the characters' mouths as best as they could. And that is an extremely difficult task. Not to mention, the original language of the game is Chinese, which is very difficult to translate, and a lot of these things will just be lost in translation. It is just, again, expected. So having Paimon to basically get all of the players on the same page in those situations can actually be a good thing, especially so early on. Now, in terms of characters during this part of the story, I think it's straightforward. The game basically gave us the building blocks of a lot of the earlier characters who are still beloved to this day. It gave us a glimpse into the grief and burden that the Archons have to shoulder, the moral ambiguity of the Fatui Harbingers, and the complicated relationship dynamics between characters such as Kaeya, Diluc, Jean, and many others. They actually did a really good job with these first batch of characters, in my opinion. Even now, looking back, like, they just genuinely did a good job with them. I still remember that subtle interaction between Diluc and Jean, and then Kaeya and Diluc, obviously, Venti with pretty much everyone, and there's also the Liyue cast. I would also say the same thing with the characters introduced alongside Dragonspine. I think Albedo was set up pretty well. The game managed to build enough intrigue around his story that I think me and a lot of other players just knew that whenever he was coming back into the story, it would get a big lore bomb. Albedo was set up to be this suspicious yet intriguing character who was like the harbinger of lore bombs, and while also still giving him the relationship dynamics with other characters that just adds to him. Although I am still wondering to this day what he meant by, like, losing control and all that, but hopefully they'll get around to that. Inazuma is what I would say to be Genshin's transition phase into a darker and more nuanced story. My reason for this is that they set up the first female Archon as the main antagonist of the game. That is ballsy. This is a character that I would want to sell, and she definitely sold, don't get me wrong. But story-wise, this is the first time that they made a morally ambiguous character who is an antagonist the center of the story. Child was probably the closest thing to a morally ambiguous character in Liyue, but he was a very clear villain, and he wasn't central at all. He was just there to be an antagonist and a villain in that part of the story. His story quest did humanize him and gave him a lot of nuance as a character, and it gave him just enough to be established into the story as this nuanced but also kind of unhinged person. But since he wasn't like central or anything, he was just clearly being set up for the long haul. No one really expected the game to explore his character in more depth right then and there. Most of us probably just knew that he would be around when we get to SNEZHNAYA, and now 6 years later, I'm still kind of waiting on that. Hopefully we do get to see more of him in SNEZHNAYA. A, on the other hand, was the Archon of the very next region that we got, and there was a lot of hype around her. Like, you don't understand the amount of hype that people had for this first female Archon, first new official region, and also first morally ambiguous possible antagonist Archon. The game has always left hints that she might not be as friendly as Venti and Zhongli, and she sure wasn't. And this is also where the story takes a bit of a serious and darker turn. In the Inazuma Archon quest, there are real people suffering. I mean, there were people suffering in Mondstadt also, but this is suffering because of the actions of the Archon or the Raiden Shogun puppet. There's an ongoing civil war with soldiers dying, and again, all of that is a direct consequence of the Raiden Shogun's actions. That is a much more mature story, for lack of a better word, mature, but it is just a different tone than the story that we got in Mondstadt and Liyue. No, not every dark story is automatically a mature story. I think what makes a more mature story is when a story requires a lot more than just simple understanding of the plot from the players. A simple story can be understood when the player can get a sense of what is going on. For example, who are the heroes and who is the villain. But the story matures once there's a second layer or even a third layer of understanding that is required. For example, the story of the Inazuma Archon quest relies heavily on the player's understanding of A's character. She's the antagonist. Most people get that, but not everyone can really understand her nuance and why she's the antagonist in the first place. Is she doing this out of her own desire to cause pain and chaos like some villains do? Or does it come from much more complex and nuanced emotion like her inability to deal with grief? And if she means no real harm, then how does her actions, regardless of her intention, affect the people around her? Are they unaffected? Or in A's case, there's a whole civil war going on because she left the Raiden Shogun puppet in charge. And of course, because she's literally an Archon, the players would need more understanding on how her own ideals play into the story. That is very different from what we got in Mondstadt and Liyue. I'm not saying the first two regions had no complexity or nuance attached, they do, but the story doesn't demand as much complexity from its characters and from the players to understand. And this shift into a more mature story is actually, in my opinion, the right direction for the game. As players, by the time that we get to what I'm going to call the transition phase, which includes Inazuma, Sumeru, and Fontaine, is actually a sign of growth in storytelling. The game is experimenting with more complex characters, more diverse villains, and morally ambiguous characters. They even gave us a very long redemption arc for Scaramouche, who, mind you, started off as a one-note villain, but across different patches and events and Archon quests, he has become one of the game's most developed characters, and I will talk more about him as we go on because the Wanderer is probably the character with the longest character arcs in the game. And that is pretty impressive to pull off, especially in a live service game that has hundreds of other characters. In this more complex stage of the game story, there are also more flawed characters introduced. Furina is a pretty heavily flawed character. Understanding her character requires a lot of empathy because you would be trying to understand someone who is struggling with a very deep sense of loneliness and isolation despite having people worshipping her and living in luxury. So the idea here is that as the story progresses and as we explore new regions, the story matures by introducing introducing new characters, and that's great because ideally what you get with more complex characters is that you would become more attached to these characters, like automatically, because they have more nuance. The more nuance that they have, the more human and real they become to players. And that is how most people get emotionally attached to fictional characters. Yes, the design can definitely be appealing, but a lot of players either see themselves in certain characters or they see an idealized version of themselves in some other characters. Or they just find the character interesting or have an interesting story or personality. The deeper the character's writing, the deeper the attachment, usually. However, this does depend on the game's execution in portraying these characters. They have succeeded and have failed miserably in portraying the complexity of certain characters. One character that comes to mind for me is Kokomi. They did her so dirty. I have made a video about it years ago because it bothered me so much. Because I think what they were trying to do with her is actually interesting. She's supposed to be this strong-willed and exceptional battle strategist who also happens to be the priestess or maiden of the Watatsumi shrine. They even had that juxtaposition of her having a softer appearance and then her job being this battle commander in war, which is an interesting contrast compared to, Raiden Shogun or Kujo Sara, who have a little bit more edge in their appearance. But the game just unfortunately never knew how to write nor portray a genius battle strategist, so they settled with her making somewhat silly mistakes in the story before becoming irrelevant alongside the rest of the resistance, even though they're the ones fighting a civil war against the shogun. And in her own story quest, the game was basically trying to make her appealing by not playing into what makes her unique as a character, but instead reverts to making her look sympathetic and overworked. And that is a flaw in execution. I think sometimes the game also just doesn't have time to portray and establish characters that should be important, like Kenichi. He's one of the Natlan heroes. He has interesting lore, he looks cool, but he's mostly just in the background, okay? And that bothers me so much. Like, Kachida got more development as a character than Kenichi in the main quest, but they also have had major success with incredibly nuanced and complex characters, even from the beginning of the game. They can't always execute it, but they definitely can, in concept, introduce these characters that will get you invested. And in some cases, the game does build them up towards something. There's always a big sense of anticipation when it comes to the 5 stars, especially ones that were teased from the beginning. I'm talking about Skirk, Varka, Alice, TSARITSA, and basically every other Archon ever since Venti and Zhongli. Like, these characters are expected to be layered, complex, and maybe a little bit morally ambiguous. And if they're not, they're still expected to, again, have layers. They are the featured characters. They need to offer more than just looking pretty. But a nuanced and complex character can't make a mature story. They can help players in becoming more invested, but they can't just carry the entire game's plot and story on their backs. So as characters and story becomes more complex, there is one thing that Genshin has had trouble doing, and that is consequences for its major characters and for its overall story arcs. Essentially, sometimes I feel like the game just have a hard time following through. I think it's kind of rare for an event that happens in the main story or for a certain character to have had lasting impact in the game. You can kind of feel it coming, the build-up is there, the excitement is there, but it's like the game kind of chickens out at the very last minute and gives us a softer landing and exit than what we anticipated, which I think isn't that big of a problem when the game launched 6 years ago. It was a new world, new characters, and new players, but as the story progresses, you kinda need the story, characters, and basically everything else to grow with you. And let me be clear, when I say consequences, I'm not just talking about permanent character deaths. I think killing off characters purely for the shock value, in my opinion, is just as harmful as never having consequences in a story. Instead, what I mean by consequences is the weight that the story is supposed to carry, the weight of the character's decisions, the events that happen in the story, and the feeling everything that we saw in the game actually matters in some way. For example, while I do think they have handled this better in more recent Archon quests, which I will get to, but in the past, they have struggled. I think they have struggled struggle. I think the way they handled Scaramouche's character arc is really good in itself. He started off as the villain and then he was developed across multiple patches until he got his own interlude quest that focuses on his backstory. And yet after so much build-up, so much anticipation and potential for interesting character moments, it was ripped away when the game decided to make him erase himself from Irminsul. And yes, the game did provide a believable explanation on why Scaramouche wanted to erase himself. It was done in a moment of grief and realization that he was never in control of his own life, and the inherent belief that he should have never been born in the first place, and also like the hope that his erasure will bring back the lives of the people who died because of him, especially the ones in Tatarasuna. However, having him actually erased from the story also erases so many of the consequences that he should have faced, and not just from a moral standpoint, from a pure narrative or storytelling point of view. It would have made his arc a lot more interesting than it already is. As of right now, his story mostly revolves around his own redemption after he became the Wanderer, and the biggest struggle that the Wanderer seems to have after the interlude quest is his desire for revenge towards Dottore, and also still being haunted by his past. I think that is already a very interesting plot and all, but if the game had not softened the impact of his full storyline, he would have needed to do that and also face everything he's ever done, and also facing someone who is basically also responsible for his abandonment issues, the woman of the hour herself, A. And that also will add layers and more nuance and complexity and interesting character moments for A, not just for the Wanderer. She will just never have to face the consequences of abandoning someone who she created, who is sentient, who now has to live life feeling like he's not good enough for his original purpose, suffers from abandonment, and eventually lead to so much suffering. Not that all of that is on A, all of that is on Scaramouche, but that is the consequences of her not really thinking through her actions, even if she was driven by grief. And that is an example that I often think of when I say they give characters who should be facing consequences a softer or an easier exit. Anyway, back to the Wanderer. He is still haunted by the guilt of taking out his pain onto innocent people for hundreds of years, the abandonment that he still feels because of A. I remember back in the day, people were so excited for the potential confrontation between the two of them, and now she doesn't remember him. And of course, lastly, they gave the Wanderer a softer exit in a sense that he doesn't have to face the consequences of abandoning his post as a harbinger, because most of the harbingers just forgot about him. But this specific nitpick isn't exclusive to Scaramouche. I think multiple harbingers just abandoned their post and there's barely any consequences, at least not ones directly from the TSARITSA or the organization itself. See, those kinds of decisions like leaving your post as a harbinger, abandoning a high-ranking title like that, should matter story-wise. It should affect the story and other characters. But the game has often just softened it so that the world itself functions like a snow globe. What a character does, even if it's major, like a harbinger leaving or dying, doesn't really affect the overarching story. Which is ironic because using the Scaramouche example, him erasing himself from Irminsul actually affects everyone and everything. They all forgot about him, but narratively, it also gives the least impact possible, which is why I find it ironic. It's wasted potential, and this is coming from someone who has praised the Wanderer's development as a character. I think at this point I mention it in every video because of how good I think it is. The game also sometimes doesn't really wrap things up well. For example, in Fontaine, despite the very good Archon quest, they didn't really explore what happened to Fontaine after Farina steps down, at least not politically. After the prophecy was stopped and Neuvillette and everyone saved the day, Farina moved out, stepped down, and nothing major actually happens in Fontaine. It's like we just almost had a major drowning. We learned that our Archon is not an Archon, and the one governing the entire nation is now the Hydro Sovereign, which, to be fair, most of the people in Fontaine have always respected Neuvillette, so I can 100% believe that they are fine with the change. But there was almost no visible or impactful change despite an Archon stepping down and also like a major disaster occurring. And this was a beloved Archon. I think people were just generally okay with it, with how they treated Furina in her story quest. I mean, it's a good story quest. It's nice to see her rediscover herself and build a new life. But narratively, to the world and to the nation of Fontaine, it was never really explored. Like, at least in Sumeru, we got some payoff about how the Grand Sage and everyone guilty was now essentially exiled, and there were major changes in the structure of the academia and how Sumeru itself operates. It felt like there were consequences from the events that we've had to play through in the past 6 to 8 hours. Sometimes I feel like these nations just function as a snow globe. They don't really affect each other very much or even at all. And when something major happens, like in the Archon quest, the nation itself and the world itself rarely changes. Obviously, in the more recent Archon quests, the characters, if they're lucky, can go through a good development, but it's often in isolation. Most of the nations have changed so much over the years. Inazuma was quite literally in lockdown when we got there, and a year later we had Albedo, Klee, and Xingqiu visiting for an event. I still love that event, by the way, like the Irodori Festival. Who remembers that? Shout out to you guys. But story-wise, the stories of each nation have always felt disconnected, at least in the main quest. I know in the world quest there are stories that make the world feel like it's growing and is actually affecting one another. Like, for example, there are Oceanids who fled from Fontaine because of Egeria, and that's how we got the Oceanids in Liyue. There's also the whole lore about the Thunderbird on Seirai Island and how it's linked to the Magukenki that we found in the Golden Apple Archipelago 5 years ago. It was mainly placed there so we could farm Kazuha's materials before Inazuma, but the game actually provided a really interesting backstory about how it even got there. And it's always a fun way to connect the massive world of Teyvat. I'm just annoyed that they don't always do this with the main story. The characters will kinda acknowledge what happened in other nations in throwaway lines, but there's never a really cohesive narrative that makes everything more interconnected, or maybe not yet. Now, in terms of characters, I think they do grow and have development, especially ones that have received so much screen time over the years, but they often just grow within confined spaces. Take, for example, A. She has definitely grown over the years. She has changed what her ideals mean to her and for her people. She is dealing with her grief better, and we love to see it. We also see Furina grow from someone who carried so much burden by herself for 500 years, got to her breaking point, and then slowly rebuilding a life that's fully for herself. And outside of the prophecy, Neuvillette is revealed to be the Hydro Sovereign, and while that's awesome, it also never really leaves its bubble. Like the growth A goes through in Inazuma, it doesn't really affect anyone outside of Inazuma. Hell, the growth that Furina went through didn't really seem to affect the people of Fontaine, despite her stepping down being a massive change in the entirety of Fontaine's political structure. Sumeru definitely saw a lot of change that came from Nahida's growth and how she slowly stepped into the shoes of a confident Archon, and I think this is actually the best example the game has when it comes to growth outside of the main quest. Nahida has matured so much since we first met her at the beginning of the Sumeru Archon quest, and her wisdom and benevolence has directly affected other characters even outside of Sumeru. This is mainly shown again through the Wanderer, who still remains as the character with the most growth across all regions. I think that's why I really like his character. He carries so much wisdom, lessons, trauma, changing worldview, all from different parts of his journey, and in turn from different nations in Teyvat. Lots of trauma from the place of his birth, Inazuma. More trauma from his time with the Fatui, SNEZHNAYA. Wisdom and benevolence from Nahida, Sumeru. And now he's still letting his experiences shape him as he works together with the Traveler. That is ideally the kind of storytelling that will make players feel like the characters are growing with them. And this is something that I hope they would do more with the Traveler and basically everyone else. I'm not saying they haven't done any of that. I think they have, but I think there's still so much untapped potential here. Without this kind of growth from its characters, they will ultimately feel like they're just stuck in a snow globe. That was the year their Archon quest concluded. But hopefully that will change as we arrive in SNEZHNAYA, because if Genshin is truly going to connect all of the Archon quest plot points into one, the time is literally right now. The Fatui, the Abyss, and everything else has always been connected. They've been connected in the world quest. They've teased conflict between the Archons as far back as Venti's, conversation with the Traveler in Mondstadt, and while I do hope one day we will experience an event as major as a major character dying or being killed off. I do hope that when it happens, it is not for the sake of shock value. If a character is to be killed off, ideally it needs to be done with intention. Their end should serve a greater story or a nice conclusion to their arc. And most importantly, it needs to have a lasting impact. And if an important character dies, the other characters hopefully carry that loss with them, especially characters who are close to the said character. Which is why I actually kind of liked that the characters like Arlecchino, Columbina, even the Wanderer, and everyone in Not Cry basically reacted to the loss of Sandrone, even though it was just for one act. But it would be nice to have that kind of storytelling where loss is just constantly carried throughout different chapters of the game, because it is such a major event, especially for a traveler. And also another reason why I would want, like, that's not necessarily more casualty, but I think casualty is just impactful, especially when you're facing a major villain, let's say Dottore. Dottore is one of the biggest villains in the game, and I think having one casualty like Sandrone is already a good step, because it was kind of hard to believe that Ratlan and Inazuma was in this state of chaos, of war, but there were barely any casualties that are major characters. Most of the characters that are impacted that way are NPCs, which can add value, don't get me wrong, but it is just a different kind of impact, you know? But again, I do want major casualties, just not at the expense of the character being gone too soon. Like Signora and I think the captain, they still had so much to offer, but sadly, their time was just cut too short. So do I want a character death or not? Short answer, yes. Long answer, only if it's done in a way that adds to the story and if it isn't rushed. Especially when the players are just getting to know the characters like Signora, or when the character still has a lot to give to the story, also like Signora. And most importantly, if the game treats the character death like an actual character death. Like, I don't want to be playing a summer event after a major character death, you know? There's also really no big impact from the 3 major storylines yet. The keyword here is yet, because they have been building 3 big storylines since the beginning. The Fatui and the TSARITSA collecting the Gnosis, the Abyss Order and the Twin, and Celestia. And because there's been a lot of build-up over the years and increasing stakes, consequences are actually more important now than ever before, and which is why I'm kind of worried. It has always bothered me how the Fatui is just basically business as usual despite losing half of its harbingers at this point. And I do hope that with that build-up, they are leading up towards something. How's the Abyss Order going to react, you know? And that is why I'm so nervous going into SNEZHNAYA, because the stakes are just so high, not just for like the characters, but also the storytelling of the game. And despite my worries and also how my opinions are over the years about the state of the game and how it tells its story, I do think that things are changing, and they're changing for the better. So I started this script genuinely thinking that I had outgrown the story of Genshin a little bit, but then we returned to Sumeru, and suddenly I saw a lot of storylines that I had felt were just left hanging suddenly got the conclusion and payoff that it deserved. Granted, I had to push back making this video because it took 6 hours to really get through the quest, and I was genuinely invested. Like, I was so pleased and had so much fun by the quest and how it turned out that I just really wanted to include it in this video. Anyways, spoilers for the newest Archon quest. I forgot the title, but I will put it on the screen. You don't understand just how much I was so excited to see that the quest started off with Kale. Kale, despite being kind of in the background in the past few years, was actually the beginning of Genshin, at least in the webtoon. If you didn't know, Genshin has a webtoon, and the story follows Kale, who ended up in Mondstadt after she escaped from Dottore. It's also established in the webtoon that Dottore and his subordinates injected god remains into Kale, and it was sealed by Sino, and he brought her to Sumeru. That's how Kale ended up under Tignari's care, and then the traveler met her at the start of the Sumeru Archon quest. It's interesting because Kale has always been the starting point of Sumeru, even before the game was released, and Dottore was always the OG villain. Other than Kale, Dottore is also responsible for pretty much all of Scaramouche's suffering, if you forgot, and those storylines have not been resolved until now. I mean, for the Wanderer, I sort of expected that they would eventually get back to it because they were building up to that confrontation with the Wanderer, implying he still wanted revenge, but he already built this new life, so is he going to throw that all away just for the sake of revenge against Dottore? That was his main dilemma. But for Kale's story and character arc, the last big hint that we got was the Sumeru trailer with Dotori burning down Irminsul. And that was, what, 3.5, 4 years ago? And now years later, we have finally reached the end of her arc. Dotori finally meets his end for real. We also finally get to see and understand the Irminsul being on fire from the teaser. Holly having God remains was even mentioned and resolved in the quest. I genuinely just did not expect that. And guys, even the Wanderer had essentially completed his character arc. I've always said this again, that he just started his redemption arc in the interlude quest 3.5 years ago. But now that redemption arc is completed. He is mostly redeemed. He has grown so much, and even the characters in the game acknowledge this. They're acknowledging it in real time. We can actually see the ripple effects from the choices being made by the characters. The Wanderer is no longer driven by pain and destruction, but we can see him actively making decisions purely because he thinks it's the right thing to do. And that has caused a ripple effect that we can see affecting important characters like Durin and even Paimon, which I will get to. There's this one scene where the Traveler is like, don't throw your life away, because the Traveler knows the Wanderer doesn't value his own life. That's why he erased himself from Irminsul. So for the Wanderer to listen to the Traveler and not just mindlessly throw away his life in order to get his revenge on Dotori is amazing to me. It is like giving the players a chance to see just how much he has grown as a character. Not only in his choices, but also in the way he sees himself and his self-worth. And maybe this sounds like Wanderer glazing to you and it's completely biased. Sue me, I like how his character arc was handled. And as someone who was very critical of Paimon's role, I was really happy to see her growth as a character. Listen, I love that she feels like a real character now. Sometimes with the role that she plays, she just doesn't feel like a character. She feels like a prop to me, like the mascot of the game, which can be a good and a bad thing. I've already mentioned the bad, but in this quest, she feels like a character. And I absolutely loved how they executed showing just how much of a character Paimon is in more recent quests. Yes, she gets worried about the Traveler, but the thing is, it was always about the Traveler. It was never about her. She herself feels like she hasn't really been the most useful as a person, and she wants to change that. She starts to volunteer to go on dangerous quests, and the game gave that moment to the Wanderer, not the Traveler. And the Wanderer even had to drag it out of Paimon. It's not something that she says out loud, which actually is kind of interesting for a character or a mascot whose role is to spell out everything for us. It was just a very intriguing moment for me. And I think it's fitting that they gave the moment to the Wanderer because I think he is the character who also understands helplessness more than anyone else. The Traveler is many things, but they are not helpless. So I find it fitting that they gave this moment with Paimon to the Wanderer, someone who was consumed by helplessness and agony and who has also rebuilt his life and found new hope. I was also amused by the fact that Dotori brought up that he was not gonna restore the Wanderer's past as Scaramouche from Irminsul because it was just difficult and he couldn't be bothered to do so. Dotori in that scene was just trying to get under the Wanderer's skin and he failed to do so, which became a moment of character growth. And Dotori tried. He really tried by bringing up the Wanderer's past mistakes as Scaramouche. He taunted him and threatened him, threatened to destroy everything that the Wanderer has built since he turned a new leaf, and it didn't work. So just from those two scenes, from a very good Archon quest, I think we are going in the right direction. And yes, you might say that Genshin has always had consequences and they were always building up to something. We just needed to be patient. And while I do agree to an extent that certain things do need time to establish, again, the Wanderer as a character would have not worked had they just flipped the switch immediately and made him a good guy just by saying, oh, he's good now. If that happened, I probably would have made a video why the Wanderer is bad, but they didn't do that, so thank God. He's still a bit of an ass right now, but you can clearly tell he had the time to really grow throughout the story, and because it took such a long time, it feels more organic. However, for a long time, there was always the feeling of disconnect in the world of Teyvat. Each region always felt like a snow globe, as I've said time and time again. Hell, even often the Archon quest and the world quest feel like they're disconnected. But seeing Jet and Lilopar and everyone come together in Sumeru makes the world feel so much more alive, and more importantly, it makes the story that we have played through matter. All of the journey and hardships that the traveler and the other characters went through matters, and this kind of storytelling is the kind that grows. So did we outgrow Genshin Impact? Yes, we have definitely outgrown its old mode of storytelling, but even when it's flawed, I personally believe that Genshin is taking the steps to grow its story alongside its audience. Now let's hope that this claim doesn't age badly when we get to SNEZHNAYA. And that is all I have to say for this. I really wanted to make a video about outgrowing the story of this game. Clearly, I have not outgrown it. I am still very invested, now more than ever. I'm so excited to go into SNEZHNAYA. I can't believe it's been 6 years, and I can't believe we're almost in SNEZHNAYA. It's unbelievable. It's crazy how excited I am, and honestly, I really liked the new Archon quest. I don't care what anyone says. I really liked how they handled Nahida, the Wanderer, Kale, Tignari, Sino, Alhaitham, everyone, the Traveler, Paimon. Guys, I owe Paimon an apology. Like, well, I owe her character now an apology. It's just been really fun to play Genshin and to experience its stories. This game will always have a special place in my heart, and I'm so excited to still do this for fun. And I hope you guys are also having fun listening to me yap about Genshin. And if you're still here somehow, thank you for listening. And I will see you guys again soon. And soon in SNEZHNAYA. So crazy to say. Anyway, I appreciate you guys so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.